Hi everyone, I'm Alan Miller, co-founder of the Together Association, and it's a very exciting day today because I'm lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Ryan Cole. And many of you will know both of these doctors. They've been very clear about some of the questions and how they've been addressing the public and attempt to engage with different ideas than much of the things that we've been presented with. And the goal today is to talk to them a bit more at depth and to go through some of this with them. So thank you very much for joining Together Talks. Let me start with you, Dr. Malone. I think it was in...
And we can make it Robert, it's okay.
Lovely, I love that. So I think it was in 1987 that you performed a landmark experiment where you were mixing strands of messenger RNA droplets with fat to create the molecular, what people call a stew or something. But that all sounds very technical. Have I got that right? Can you give us a little idea of the kind of provenance of that, if you would?
So you're asking what is the genesis of the original mRNA inventions?
Exactly.
I was working as a graduate student in a postdoc lab at the Salk Institute in the molecular biology and virology labs, passionately pursuing a career in gene therapy. Right. I wanted to be a MD that would cure pediatric genetic disease. That was my dream. And the way to do it at the time, the leading technology involved retroviruses. And San Diego was the place to be. The two leading people were there, Ted Friedman, who'd originally come up with the idea in the 70s, and Inder Verma, who had come from David Baltimore's lab and was really one of the world's experts in retroviruses, which is the main platform that was being used. And so I weaseled my way in as a graduate student into an intensely competitive postdoc lab at the Salk, and had to carve out some niche where I wasn't going to get just overrun by the postdocs. And so that niche was how did the RNA assemble into a retrovirus particle? And I thought it was going to be simple. I could just make RNA and it would be genetically modified, have the things that I wanted, and then I could use the same technology that was used for putting DNA into cells, in cultured cells. I could use it for RNA, and everything would be hunky-dory, and I could do reverse genetics and cool science and get along with that. None of that turned out to be true. Nobody had really made large quantities of pure mRNA that could be used to produce protein in cells. And all the tech that existed at the time for putting DNA, this double-stranded version, into cells just didn't work. And I tried them all, and I spent quite a bit of time developing the recombinant DNA system and how to cook the RNA in large quantities. It was really scary. It was like $5,000 worth of enzymes in a single tube. For a graduate student at age 27 in the 1980s, that was high risk experiment. I got those things solved and still could not get the RNA into cells with liposomes. I went to UCSF, worked with Judy White, one of the top liposomologists at the time. Nothing seemed to work very well. It's very frustrating. And then Tony Hunter, a brilliant scientist at the Salk and kind of occasionally mentioned for a Nobel, came to me and he said, "Hey, Robert, I heard about this new tech out of this company, Syntex, involving positively charged fats, and I think you ought to look into it." And so I made the phone call, set up the arrangements, and as a good graduate student, well-trained, I wrote initial patent disclosures, invention disclosures, and all that before we did that. And they couldn't, at Syntex, they couldn't get RNA to work for the reasons that I'd been banging my head against the wall for a couple of years, because they didn't know how to make it and all that other infrastructure stuff. So they had the positively charged fat tech at Syntex, and I had all of the manufacturing pure RNA and knowing how to detect it and all that tech. And they shipped me their reagent, and it was like, lightning. Suddenly everything worked. There was not a cell line at the Salk Institute that I could find that I couldn't put RNA into and get luciferase protein. This is the first real use of luciferase in this way also. This is this firefly protein that was actually used by Pfizer in their studies to justify these current jabs that are going forward, instead of actually using the protein that was the spike. So that's how that all came together. And then having done that, I was helping teach an embryology course, and I had access to a variety of different types of embryos, like frog embryos and chick embryos. And I just, kind of a lark, I said, well, let's see what happens if we take this and put it on that. Lo and behold, that worked. It's like nothing went wrong. Everything worked. It was an amazing time. And then the fight started over the intellectual property.
Right. And there's a lot of discussion about that. But what I'd really like to get to, because a lot of people that will be watching, it'd be very good to sort of talk through with you some of the thoughts on this, because you've been quite vocal, and I'd like to hear from you now just some of your thoughts about, so obviously there's this technology. Some people were saying, well, it just got conjured up 6 months beforehand or whatever. That's what some people say.
Oh, you're talking about the technology for these vaccines, which I had nothing to do with producing these vaccines. We're all clear on that.
Yeah. But I wonder to what extent, when was it for you when you looked at what was happening with kind of the response and in relationship to this mRNA vaccine for COVID? When did alarm bells start ringing for you about it?
I get this question all the time. What was the epiphany? What was the red pill moment for me? And I think with a lot of us, and certainly in my case, it's a series of events. It's not an event. It was a gradual awakening or illumination that things weren't right. Over time, I had switched from being a discovery research scientist to focusing on making products. We call that advanced development. That juncture happened right after the anthrax attacks, when I went to work on a contract for the Department of Defense, where I had clinical responsibility for virtually all biodefense products for the DoD that were under development. And so I kind of pivoted from being a discovery lab guy to a clinical development regulatory affairs guy. Right. And it took me about a decade to master that whole toolkit of learning all the rules and regs and the European standards and the Indian standards and the American standards, blah, blah, blah. And so I was deeply steeped in bioethics, which is required training. Yeah. I'd completed a fellowship in global clinical research at Harvard Medical School. And so I had all of this teaching that I'd absorbed about the proper way to do things. And I was, when you go through that, you're indoctrinated in that if you do this thing wrong, the FDA will come down on you. If you do this thing wrong, the FDA will come down on you. You could lose your license. You could get a 483. You could never be able to do clinical research. All this stuff, okay? And then suddenly, none of it seemed to matter. They just threw it right in the trash can. All this stuff that I had been taught and all my peers had been taught, and I'd practiced for years. I was a clinical director at multiple contract research organizations, ran many clinical trials, and suddenly all the rules were right out the window. And the one that bothered me the most was the rules about bioethics. And bypassing that and the failure to provide informed consent, and at the time it was coercion and compelling, in particular, children. I had a phone call late into the night with a Canadian physician who wishes to remain unnamed. They raided his office, they destroyed his computer because he was giving ivermectin in early treatment. And before all that happened, he had been on the phone with me just talking to me about what was happening in Canada. and the giving ice creams to get children to accept the vaccine. Right. And these practices that I knew as a clinical researcher, if I designed a clinical study in which I said I was going to do these things, the oversight group would have said, "Are you crazy? Go back and rewrite your protocol. There's no way we would allow this." And yet that was now the norm. That he begged me to intervene in some way with the Canadian regulatory authorities. And I had to say, I know American regulatory people, and I can call people and get stuff done, but I don't have contacts in Canada. And I woke up the next morning. Jill and I are both trained. Jill Glassbill-Malone, my partner in all this, Dr. Jill. And we're both well trained in bioethics. And I woke up with the aha moment that there was something I could do for him and for Canadians, which was to write an essay on the bioethics and what was going wrong here. And that was a key turning point, but it was one of many. I mean, when I first got this phone call from a CIA officer on January 4th of 2020 saying there's a novel coronavirus and it looks like it's a problem and you got to get your team going, this being a team that I have worked with in the past for drug repurposing, et cetera. I did my usual threat assessment. This is not my first rodeo, and decided that there was no way that a safe and effective vaccine could be produced quickly enough to make an impact on death and disease that my colleague was envisioning when it came to the States, and that we should focus on repurposed drugs. So it's been kind of, that was my starting point, and then seeing Operation Warp Speed roll out. When there was a Canadian scientist who obtained the Common Technical Document, is the formal phrase, which is the dossier that Pfizer had to submit, and they submit the same dossier to every nation state. Okay, it's a Common Technical Document, European language, and so they had submitted the Japanese one. And most of it was in Japanese, except the data tables and figures and legends were still in English. And so I was asked to review this when it was first discovered on a Japanese regulatory server. And I was shocked. I couldn't believe what Pfizer had submitted was being allowed to justify human clinical research and clinical trials and then subsequently the jabs. And so I took it to a more senior regulatory professional, colleague of mine, and asked him, "Am I missing something?" And he said, "Oh no, everything you think is wrong here is in fact wrong. And there's a couple of things that you missed that are also wrong." And so that also got written up as an essay, and that was another kind of pivotal one. And then in this cascade of events, I was still assuming that what was going on was that the drug companies had somehow hoodwinked the federal government because this new tech and I knew the FDA didn't have the depth of knowledge that I had about these formulations and the technology and the assays and all this kind of stuff. So I was assuming that the FDA was acting in good faith, right? And that they just weren't aware that they were being bamboozled. And so I arranged for a phone call with Peter Marks to go over my concerns based on this Common Technical Document. And we had that Zoom call together. I thought it was just going to be scientist to scientist and we could talk turkey. Chatham House rules, my understanding, is the language that's used here. Yeah. And instead, a PR officer from FDA was on together with him. And I voiced my concerns. And he said, "Well, I've received much more data now from Pfizer. And I've reviewed those data, and I have no concerns about any of these things. They've really addressed all the things that you're raising." That turns out, in retrospect, to be the data package that Pfizer and the FDA tried so hard to keep from any of us seeing. And any of us that have reviewed those data now would say, if you did a rigorous job reviewing that, there's no way you would have said that you had no concerns. So I, frankly, was lied to. And then I took the jabs of necessity because I wanted to travel. I had long COVID. Supposedly that would help. And with the second one, I developed a cluster of symptoms that we now know are classic adverse events. We didn't know then. I developed hypertension to 230, POTS syndrome, restless leg, narcolepsy, tinnitus, of course, a number of these things. And I still have problems with my blood pressure. I don't play this up, but the honest truth is I'm also a vaccine injured person.
Right.
So this cascade of things, one after the other, resulted in me just having more and more awareness that what was being done wasn't right at all.
So I want to ask both of you actually what happened, right? Why you think that happened. We were told in Britain and internationally that it was all so threatening, such a big threat and so dangerous, and we didn't know what it meant, even though some people like Professor John Ioannidis and others had said that the fatality rate was
Professor Ferguson, I think, was,
yes, we did.
Right
the
at the center
got it
of
so
that.
wrong before with foot and mouth disease, but it was presented as this is the thing, it has to go and we have to make it happen fast in order to deal with it. But so I wonder from both of your points of view, and you said this morning actually on the news in Britain, Ryan, that to say that there's all the scientific doctors say something, it might be the case if you don't allow other people, other doctors, other scientists, immunologists, epidemiologists not to speak, which clearly we've seen a travesty of censorship. But maybe just responding, Ryan, what do you, what Robert's just explained there, what in your opinion actually happened? And I'll come back to you, Robert, see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I come at this from, I did some PhD work in immunology, virology. Obviously, I'm a pathologist. And as Robert likes to say, we pathologists are the quality control of medicine. So we're pattern observers. Our job is to notice patterns and point out patterns. Well, historically, I knew coronaviruses and trials for, even before we get to the technology, they mutated at a rate that is always ahead of vaccine efforts. So with SARS-CoV-1, with MERS, with animal coronaviruses, cows, pigs, dogs, cats, etc., that have their own families of coronaviruses, vaccine trials have always failed. And then when the animal's exposed to a new variant of the virus, they actually end up with enhanced disease and or even worse outcomes, some death. So the problem for me was one doesn't do science at warp speed. That's not good science. And again, as Robert pointed out very astutely, in anything acute in medicine, you focus on what the early treatment is. And none of these could have been approved, of these injections could have been approved if there were a successful treatment. So the suppression of early treatment, and it states that clearly in the EUA requirements, the emergency authorization requirements.
In the United States.
Yeah, in the United States, that if you are going to emergency authorize these shots, there's no other therapy. And so that was intentionally pushed aside.
Unlike something like Tamiflu and the flu, because that's
right,
not an emergency.
Yeah,
right.
things like that. And historically, if you go back to 2005, there was a paper from Fauci's NIH that said, look, for SARS-CoV-1, hydroxychloroquine seems to be a very effective drug. And then we knew in the laboratory setting that dengue, yellow fever, Zika, HIV, coronaviruses all responded in the laboratory to ivermectin. There's a little transporter that keeps the virus from getting in.
And many of them respond to hydroxy.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we knew there were early treatment drugs that would inhibit viral entry and replication. So it was shocking to many of us looking at this thinking the answer that was given around the world is we must wait for a shot. Well, the other problem with that, just knowing basic science, is when you put selection pressure on a microbe, it will mutate around what you're trying to do. And so we put this gene sequence into these lipids and put it into people's arms and made people's bodies make this spike protein, which we now know is the toxin of the virus. That spike protein is the toxic aspect. And when we did that, the virus kept mutating around it. And so doing a big vaccine push was never a good idea amidst a fast-spreading virus that was going to mutate.
Right. And so it begs us the obvious silly question, but Why did this happen, in your opinions? I mean,
So I'm gonna, my point of view on this is biased by the fact that I was introduced to this from the perspective of my longstanding relationship with Defense Threat Reduction Agency and some of these people in the intelligence community that are in biodefense. Okay, so at the time, I'm sitting kind of within the system at the interface of the for-profit sector and the government in this biodefense space. And so for me, in January and February, I was inundated with what we now know, as were we all, what we now know was propaganda. The dying in the streets in China, the build out of the hospital, remember that? I thought all that was real, like many of us did. And I bought hook, line, and sinker the idea that this was a highly lethal variant. It had been introduced to me as a highly lethal variant.
right.
So my first encounter with this was a reaction of, good heavens, this could put my children at risk. This could put my wife at risk. I can't tell you what it's like to have expertise in this area and work in this area when a new one comes in. For me, your sense of threat and threat response just gets activated. You get an adrenaline surge,
Right.
and you work crazy long hours to try to mitigate the risk to the general population and also to the people close to you. So what we now know in retrospect, and a lot of this has come from citizen journalists because, as you know, the corporate media in the United States has largely been capitalized by various government agencies interested in pushing a particular storyline. So the Brownstone Institute in particular, I think, has done a fantastic job of tracking down the early events, and it's quite clear that a combination of propaganda coming from unclear sources, probably within the U.S. intelligence community, in addition to propaganda coming from the CCP that was brought down through the National Security Council in the White House, yielded a situation, as you say, where many of the decision makers in the White House and in the U.S. government, and what I think we've all learned, is that there's this close relationship between the U.S. government and its lead agencies, FDA, HHS in particular, seem to be the lead for European regulatory authorities, many of the Western regulatory authorities all over the world take their lead from what's going on in the United States. And so all this fear came in through the top level into the White House and then pushed out to stakeholders in the government, pushed out to our partners, our NATO partners, et cetera. And in the European Parliament, we now know, in the European Union, and we were all consumed and just surrounded by this fear that appears to have been exploited by a variety of stakeholders that obtained benefit from exploiting that environment of fear in the form of really, in retrospect, egregious contracts, for instance, for the vaccines, and economic actions that result in the most massive upward transfer of wealth in modern history. I mean, a whole series of things happened right around that time.
Can I just
and so it's hard to disambiguate cause and effect,
Right.
and whether, and then we have this other bizarre variable of this event 201 that occurred in what in the States is widely known as a CAA shop within Johns Hopkins University that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, in which these policies, these propaganda methods, the totalitarian things that we've all experienced, were all war gamed. Being as gentle as possible, it's appropriate that a government should do war games, one would think, planning, right, for major threat events. Yeah. But if you select as the people participating in the planning people that all have a tendency, a bias towards more authoritarian responses, you're going to end up with a work product that's pretty authoritarian. And lo and behold, that's what happened. And then they implemented it.
So there's a lot there. But I mean, for instance, in Britain, the government at the time and Boris Johnson, they didn't go down that road immediately. And actually, they did a U-turn after having a lot of pressure put on them by a very particular demographic that were quite vocal. You could say there's lots of reasons why perhaps they then went down a different road. It sounds like what you're saying is you think that it sounds like a kind of almost like military industrial kind of thing that's happened that then is being executed maybe through people that don't know about that, right? It's quite a big claim.
The documentation now is getting quite strong. And the tension currently in the States in terms of trying to dissect the early events where the policies were put in place and kind of once they had their own momentum, they carried on, bureaucrats being what they are, is that there was a strong component of the Department of Defense in this and also a strong component of Homeland Security. And it's hard to say whether this is revisionism. These different bureaucracies battle with each other. But the data are suggesting, the documentation are suggesting that Health and Human Services in the United States played more of a backseat role. And that because this came down through national security, it went to the operational branches responsible for Homeland Security and for defense in general, which, by the way, we talk about Tony Fauci and some think he's a hero and some think not so much. Tony is a unique person in the U.S. government, or has been, because he has one leg in HHS and the other leg in the biodefense industrial complex. This occurred after 9/11. There was a transition. That's why he got his big raise. And people think of him just as head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, but in fact, functionally, he is the head of the entire biodefense complex in the United States. That's been his operational role. He has massive resources at his command. And so he kind of did become the juncture for these, but when you sort through the paperwork, the contracts, the nitty-gritty documentation of what happened and when, it's hard to come to any other conclusion than because of this set of circumstances, we were in a tense situation with China. We had all of this about the origin of the virus and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which Defense Threat Reduction Agency was funding, NIH was funding. Yeah. For some reason, the U.S. government responded to this using more of their national security, intelligence, and DoD assets rather than responding to this in the way that I was always used to in prior outbreaks, where it was more of a health and human services driven response effort.
Well, we here, public health and policy has been quite increasingly prominent in the last 20 years. In actual fact, before what we saw in the last 3 years, in a range of areas, often where things like nudge restriction has come in. So they've been very vocal about, for instance, people going out day and night. They, rather than saying it's entertainment, they'll say it's antisocial behaviour and alcohol-related harms. And they'll use the public health agenda, if you would like, to say that people should be doing less of types of activity. So there had been that kind of thing going on for a while, but it seemed to be put on steroids. I remember I was in New York at the time that you're talking about, and we'd just seen the Diamond Princess situation.
And just to put a pin in that, the gentleman that had called me from Wuhan on January 4th was the one that managed the Diamond Princess.
Oh, is that right? Which seemed to anyone that was looking at it to give you quite a good petri dish in some ways.
Absolutely.
Of what you might look at, right? You'd say, okay, well, that doesn't sound too cataclysmic.
Well, and you had a
Didn't add up.
you had a great control there because you had the Diamond Princess, and then you also had the USS Roosevelt aircraft carrier.
Right.
So now you had the perfect lab-to-lab experiment because on that Diamond Princess, who succumbed and who didn't do well? Elderly, comorbid. A handful succumbed. Then you looked at that ship of 5,000 sailors, and there was one with comorbidities that didn't do well. But you had your perfect lab model right there, and it lined up perfectly with what happened with SARS-CoV-1. And when that kind of burned itself out in Asia,
I'm glad you brought the Roosevelt up. I think that I remember quite intimately both of those and what the chatter was that was going on within the government.
Yeah.
And the Roosevelt event was a shock that ran through DOD.
How so?
That captain was defrocked. He took an aircraft carrier off battle station. That's like, you don't do that. For what turned out to be a marginal compromise in terms of health, but I believe, can't be in his head, I believe he was also caught up in all of this fear that was propagated, and he clearly believed, based on his statements, that he had an obligation to protect his sailors. And in retrospect, he overreacted. But those events, I was talking to people that were at that base where the carrier went, pathologists that had blood samples, and that whole cascade of events was like an earthquake.
Well, one of the things, I want to go backwards a bit as well, because we go forwards and backwards, but it seemed to me striking that in what was a very loud, noisy, everyone needs to be very scared discourse. I remember in New York as well that the dishonesty about certain things. So for instance, at the time it was Governor Cuomo, I think, and you talk about comorbidities and the demographics and the differentials between them. And I think, as you say, it was known quite early on, but there were people that had died with it, or some of it, and often they were in refrigerators in New York, and some of the rest of the public got very scared because they thought everyone was at risk, and they weren't honest about what was going on in the care homes, and there were some similar things elsewhere. But I suppose the question is, I've just seen on CNN, of all places, that there's now a discussion, like there is in America, that perhaps some of the death figures around COVID are overly...
Lena Wen in the
Yeah.
Washington Post
Yes.
yesterday.
overly
Yesterday, yeah.
exaggerated, and that perhaps we need to differentiate from people that have specifically died from COVID.
Which is something we've been saying like forever.
Those who've got comorbidities.
What I said on Rogan and I got slammed for.
Exactly. Those who've got comorbidities and it might have influenced it, and those that have just been run over and then also happen to have something on a test as well. And back then, people were called crazy when people were saying it before, and when you were saying it and others. But
then it all got validated.
Right,
And
so-
it got validated that there were these perverse financial incentives to overcall death. Hospitals got paid extra. And that's another one of those, how the heck did that happen questions?
is that what happened in the state? Because
Absolutely.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Definitely.
And so in trying to get to the bottom of that stack of issues, one of the things that has come to fore is a case can be made that was a quid pro quo, because the government, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the hospital shall no longer perform elective surgery and other elective procedures. And in the United States, a very different system from the one you have, as opposed to your NHS, we have basically insurance companies and very large investment funds control our whole hospital system.
Right.
And so they're very attuned to margins, cost margins. And because of our insurance structure, Medicare, hospitals basically can't make a profit doing the routine stuff that hospitals do. They have to make their profit margins on elective procedures. And the government said, you will not do any more elective procedures because we're afraid we're going to be jammed for beds. And furthermore, elective procedures bring people in that are going to spread disease from the hospital environment. It appears that there was a quid pro quo. We are going to prohibit you from doing elective procedures, and we're going to subsidize you because otherwise you're going to go bankrupt. Okay, nobody wants that either. We're going to subsidize you in these various ways, and they subsidize them by, and I'm sure there was lobbying involved in this, I can't see how it would be otherwise. There was a major subsidy for use of remdesivir. There was a major subsidy for use of ventilation. And so what do we get over use of remdesivir and over use of ventilation? What a shock. And there was incentives for if anyone was diagnosed with the disease, that got a plus up. If someone was determined to have died of the disease at a time when autopsies are forbidden, so the criteria became if you were PCR positive, then you had the disease by definition, and if you were dead and had a PCR positive test in your lab records, then by definition you died of that infection, and you got your bonus, right? And then on top of that, we have layered the fact that those PCR tests were widely abused by increasing the cycle number so that it was really easy to get a positive test or a false positive test. Yeah. Nobody ever bothered to do the proper laboratory assessments of false positive and false negative rates in the context of what the incidence of disease, all that technical stuff that normally has to be done. They threw all that stuff out the window. And what we ended up with, it was clear and transparent from the very beginning, was this gross overestimate of risk and disease and death, which fed right back into this whole fear porn propaganda effort to scare everybody and compel compliance with the public health policies that were being propagated from WHO down through CDC and across the US government.
Although at the time as well, the WHO did change its position, didn't it? Because originally it was saying that it didn't not go.
On remdesivir it did, that was fascinating.
Yeah,
but the United States didn't.
Right.
Fall of 2020, they said don't use remdesivir. There are a lot of things that many nations continued to follow, even though the data didn't support it.
Right.
And so they did reverse course on several things.
How much do you think that is? Because I think everyone, it was impossible not to notice, but we all know what it was like. It was kind of easy to forget, surprisingly, but how it was difficult to speak out and to say things, and there was this kind of
we don't forget
silencing, censorship.
It still happens,
right? Indeed.
Yeah.
We've just seen with the Twitter files and all of that.
And don't be confused. Just because the Twitter files are being dropped, we're still having shadow banning and information control through Twitter, let alone Facebook and all the other platforms. But Twitter is not a free space. You still have to be very cautious.
And this brings up the point as to why many people still are kind of on the fence or confused about what's real, what's not. And as you alluded to in the interview I did this morning, all doctors and scientists agree when you censor the ones who don't. And Galileo was right, but they still threw him in the tower. And so in science, you have to have dialogue and oppositional voice. We don't have to agree. And I say all the time, and in pathology, I say, look, if you have better data than I have, then bring it.
Yeah.
And then on behalf of the patient, we'll come to an agreement. But when you silence good science and good medicine and good knowledge base and critical thinking, then the outcomes can be guided and directed in ways that can be obviously disastrous and have been in many cases.
Or to put a pin on that one, they can be directed in ways that advance the interests of commercial actors that are stakeholders.
Well, I've got so many questions for you. It's terrifying, because on the one hand, I want to ask a bit about what it's like with your peers and contemporaries and others, and talk a bit more about that. But I am minded to think that in many ways, the people that have been running society in Britain and Europe and in the States
Who are those people?
often find it difficult to keep anything secret. They find it difficult to hold the line on many things. Often what has caricatured them in the last couple of decades is a disorientation and a rudderlessness. So it is striking, and this idea that is being presented a little bit, right? This idea that whether it's a covert group within inside, is it much more that it's a kind of directed thing? It's sounding like, if I'm right with what you're saying, that there's this kind of, from the kind of military defense side of things, that then exacerbates some big companies that make a lot of money, and that's the combined interest. And yet there's so many different players everywhere and so many people and participants, and people have been so incapable of...
So what you're asking is this an emergent phenomena? Is it a conspiracy, or is it just incompetence, or is it a mixture of the three? And my answer is it's a mixture of the three.
And I always say beware that public-private partnership, because again, then there are players with an interest that are going to lobby the public governmental interests to their own ends, and that's where we run into the problem. I agree with Robert; it is all three, but that's the challenge we face. And even I'm going to go back in the story just briefly to throw this in. If you go back in 2019, Tony Fauci and Rick Bright are at the Milken Institute, and they're bemoaning how long it takes to get a vaccine to market and all the years of testing and approval. And then one of them says, well, gosh, if we had a pandemic and an emergency, we could emergency authorize mRNA and use this new platform under emergency. So they almost projected what they wanted to do. So again, it's these scientific interests run by a handful of insiders or bureaucrats, and then the cronyism within large pharmaceutical companies.
So can I just pick at that thread just a little bit?
Please do.
So I know Rick Bright personally. I have for years. Okay, I know Richard Hatchett of CEPI for many years. I know what his background is. So that's one of the weird things about the position I'm in. Rick Bright's job before he joined BARDA was basically working for Bill and Melinda Gates on flu vaccine development. Rick Bright is deeply steeped in the thinking of what the Gates Foundation wanted. He goes to BARDA, and then he has this kerfuffle that happens with, actually one of the key players was the same gentleman that called me from Wuhan, that resulted in Rick being reassigned and then eventually leaving. And where does he go to? He goes to the Rockefeller Institute. You know, it is hard to avoid the data.
But where would you...
Objective information about the very tight, close relationships that exist in this very small community.
Right. But where would you go? I mean, some people watching this who might not have been involved in this conversation at all will say, well, obviously there are a few institutions and foundations that are there and they're funded, and their goal is to, whether it's to get rid of malaria or have clean water or have vaccinations for people, right? And surely they would have thought that would have been a good thing in principle. And also there is a concentration of wealth. There always has been. You know, obviously the monopolies were broken up somewhat in the early part of the 20th century, but now we've got some more of that. But I wonder how much you can unpick this idea, because it sounds like there's people that are not critical or just go along with things, because like you've got principles. You're saying that you've got these bioethics. You're very clear about it. What's happened to all the others then that we've got? What was your assessment and evaluation?
A lot of that, I think, goes to the fear of people stuck under the layers of these big systems. So why didn't so many of our colleagues speak out? Well, in our country, there was consolidation of the system with the Obamacare Healthcare Act. And so the majority of physicians are no longer independent. And so if you speak out or buck the trend, you don't want to be the tall blade of grass. Those speaking out were the ones that got fired first.
Or lost their licenses. They became, there was a concerted effort to make examples of high-profile individuals regarding medical licensure, ability to practice, being fired, those kinds of things. But you're also touching, so there's that, I mean, this is one of the questions we both get on about every other podcast of what the heck happened with your colleagues. And like with the other questions, it's multifactorial.
Right.
One of our colleagues, Peter McCullough, observed early on, I think it was a huge insight, that all of the docs were on the first wave of being jabbed. So they all kind of bought in at a time when the fear was high. Another factor that I've run into, particularly with physicians in the major urban centers, a lot of them have PTSD, in my opinion. If you imagine that you're a frontline doc working in a major urban hospital, let's say Northwell in New York City, just take one example that I'm very familiar with. Right. Okay, those docs, the protocols that were being used with the ventilation parameters that in part were adopted from the practices happening in Italy, in northern Italy, so gross overuse of ventilation and ventilation pressures that were basically destroying lungs, together with the remdesivir, resulted in a massive surge of death early on. And imagine that you're a highly skilled physician that has been trained to the highest degree. You're working in one of the great urban centers for medicine, and patient after patient after patient is dying. Okay, those people that I've talked to, they still have nightmares. They are profoundly affected by what occurred. And if you put yourself in their shoes, can you imagine the cognitive dissonance of having to grapple with the possibility that you contributed to those deaths through your behavior, your actions, your treatment protocols? For most people, it would be impossible to acknowledge that what occurred might have in part been avoidable. And when you talk to people like Paul Merrick and our colleague Pierre Corey of the FLCCC, who demonstrated, and so many other physicians in our group and in our circle that demonstrated early on that it was possible to salvage typically 98% of patients with these early treatments. Then if you're a hospitalist, you're faced with confronting this terrible paradox. How do you resolve that psychologically? So there's that whole trauma aspect of what they went through. Then there's the financial incentives, the fact that most physicians these days are struggling under a mountain of debt. And then there's this new thread that's come in of the migration towards protocol-based treatment in medicine rather than kind of the old school pragmatic symptom by symptom, treating the symptoms, treating the disease. This thrust to, we have a protocol, this is what we do, and there's all kinds of reasons why that happens. The hospitals and the insurance companies love that. There's a protocol, it's been blessed by our version of the NHS, Tony Fauci, or as the epitome of that. And therefore, if I follow that protocol and this patient dies, I'm absolved of liability, which means my administrator, who's not a physician these days, he's an MBA or something like that, he's absolved of liability. The insurance companies like it, everybody likes it. Stay on track, follow the system, administer the protocol, and then in comes this new data from these heretics saying, hey guys, you lost a lot of patients that you didn't have to lose. That is incredibly threatening.
Yeah, guidelines and protocols delegitimize humanity. They turn you into a widget, a number, a commodity, instead of what we went into medicine to do, and that was to take an oath to a patient and take care of a patient and see that patient as an individual. And as he said, looking through all those differential diagnoses, because you are different than Janie and Joe and Jimmy and all these other people. You have your own unique needs. and to lose that critical thinking and watch our colleagues, and to Robert's point, I agree, a lot of them were in a traumatic situation and had their cognitive biases from what they were seeing. But had we gotten to those patients earlier, I think a lot of them are waking up to, what we've been trying to share all along.
I can tell you from being in the front lines, and we published the first paper, I think, about the mast cell hypothesis. Working with pathologists and other physicians and scientists, trying to just comprehend what this disease was, what it was doing, how this multi-organ system disease that was affecting virtually, well, now we know that it's fundamentally a clotting disorder, and it affects the microvasculature, and microvasculature is like our whole body. It's how we exchange nutrients. So any organ has microvasculature, our brain, our heart, our reproductive system, everything. And this spike protein triggers coagulation in a very special way that Ryan can talk to you for another half an hour on, having to do with these densely cross-linked clots. These rubbery clots on the macro level, those also occur on the micro level, and they're blocking the vessels. And so physicians were encountering this bizarre situation where patients were coming in with this cluster of symptoms, that cluster of symptoms. We with the team at DoD working for MIT Lincoln Labs under contract, we had a big program to try to make sense out of post-COVID, long COVID, and early on when people were still in denial that this is the case. And it was wicked hard because it affects everything. There is no one syndrome. There is no one set of symptoms because it is this multi-system disease. And so a physician encountering this, each one of them, I think, kind of brought their own. He was talking about cognitive bias. The pulmonologist saw it as a pulmonary disease. The cardiologist saw it as a cardiac disease, right? The renal specialist saw it as a kidney disease. Everybody saw from their own lens. And this is one of the macro things that went all the way across, including the government, is we have become so siloed. You ask, how could people in the government not perceive what they were doing, not appreciate what they were doing? I can tell you from having been in the works, we were all living in our little tiny silos, and it was really hard for anybody to step up and look at the big picture. It is the fog of war. When these things happen, you are surrounded by the fog of war and this intense fear, and it's really hard to see the true battle lines.
Well, I think that's a really very vivid account of portrayal, but some people might ask, well, how comes then in the fog of war with something like the Manhattan Project, and whether one thinks it was put to good use?
Well, let's examine that, okay? Because that's a great metaphor. Let's pick that apart. Okay, so the Manhattan Project, they gathered a group of scientists and they isolated them.
Yeah.
And they gave them a project and all the capital they needed and a very clear objective.
Yes.
They said, this is the mission. We're going to give you all you want. We're going to stick you in the desert.
Yeah.
We're not going to let you talk to anybody else. You're going to go figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay? Nothing like that happened. There was no, we talk about Operation Warp Speed. I personally mentored the colonel who was assigned to project manage OWS for the Moderna vaccine, okay? Back when we were developing the Ebola vaccine, okay? And he came to me afterwards, later in this outbreak, and he seemed to want to unburden his heart. And he told me about some of the things that went on there. A lot of that was consensus decision-making. It was in committee, okay? It was not rational drug development, stepwise analysis, the things that Mark's, who's here with us, is a pharmaceutical specialist, the world that he lives in and that I was trained to live in, where we work methodically according to protocols by these international standards, etc., all that got thrown out the door. And I can tell you the reason why the Moderna dose is what it is compared to Pfizer is because the committee split the difference. Some of them wanted to go for 300 mics, and some wanted to go for 30 mics and went for 100 mics.
And I like
that is no way to do drug development.
Yeah,
but that's what happened all the way through.
Good science is not done by consensus. And I like to joke that no one of us is as dumb as all of us. And so when we go to this consensus, his great discovery early on, that was eureka. That wasn't a consensus committee finding. It was him coming up with a great idea. All science.
There was no way that could have happened.
Don't you build on the sorry to interrupt, but don't you build on the shoulders of one another?
You do, absolutely. But most advances in science come in leaps and bounds from an accidental discovery. And it's cross-pollinating ideas in scientific areas, and you're looking and using that critical thinking skill. But if you're stuck in the elephant tail to trunk, trunk to tail in the circus, all walking in that same circle together, and you have a ringmaster just barking out directions, you are never going to break out of that circus.
So this is, so I'm sorry to pump the book, but this is why, this is the journey that's captured in this book, The Lies My Government Told Me and the Better Future Ahead, is what was this cascade of events? And as you work through the government's response and the kind of this emergent phenomena, that included media and the Trusted News Initiative, all these various actors, pharma, et cetera. I mean, we now know Scott Gottlieb is directly in there tweaking what's going to be allowed to be spoken about on behalf of Pfizer, leveraging his former position at the FDA. I mean, if you want to see a closed circle, that's a pretty good one. But what is clear is that we had massive groupthink. This well-known phenomena that has bedeviled American foreign policy for decades, since mid-century at least, was clearly in action here. We had this small insular group of in people, the in crowd, that all knew each other. Here's a fun fact. Deborah Birx was Tony Fauci's postdoc. Know that? Did you know that Drew Weissman, Grieco and Weissman, the pseudouridine, was a Tony Fauci postdoc? Okay. Did you know that Bob Redfield was formerly of DOD, very tight with Deborah Birx because they come from the same places, okay, and was tight as a tick with Bob Gallo, who was Tony Fauci's major nemesis partner. I mean, it is a incredibly tight insular circle.
So when your family tree doesn't branch, you end up with problems. And
so what you're saying is because of that, there was a lack of willingness to question or challenge or break out of the mold.
In groupthink, there's a force that will lead these small groups to value internal consensus over the overall objectives, being tight and remaining tight with their own internal consensus is more important than achieving the mission. And it will override fundamental ethics. This is well documented. This is standard political science. It's been taught in textbooks for years.
Well, no, I hear that, although you could make some counterclaims to that. Like there are people that might say that at different junctures, people who had principles and committed to them would challenge things. I get the point that the idea of groupthink, everyone goes along with it. But here's the question that many people will be asking, I'm sure. So would you now, in hindsight, what you've talked a bit about treatment, but also in terms of like the vaccination, right, the mRNA jab, would you see it as having served any purpose for any demographic at all, elderly with vulnerabilities, or at this point should it be paused, stopped?
So we came out with a clear, unequivocal statement about this in April 11th.
Yeah, and absolutely they need to be halted. The risk versus benefit is clear in the risk direction. The Cleveland Clinic just finished a study showing that.
How big was that?
51,000 patients, so significant, statistically significant. But it showed, look, the more jabs you get, the more you get COVID. And even Moderna's bivalent data showed that if you got the bivalence, you actually got COVID at a higher rate than the control group. The Wuhan spike that is still coded for in these shots, that spike and that variant went extinct a year and a half ago or more. The BA4, BA5 variants in the bivalents are essentially extinct as well. We have the BQ1, BQ11, the XBB 1.5, all these other variants, and that's what I was mentioning earlier. Coronaviruses always mutate ahead of our efforts.
Well, and if I can jump in on this, okay, this was foreseen.
Yes, they knew.
Okay, the literature on immune imprinting or original antigenic sin basically came out in the first quarter of last year. And it was completely ignored by the CDC and by the FDA. I didn't ignore it. I was first pinged about it by a New York Times reporter. I wrote a big essay about it, and then I testified about the implications of those data for the boosters that were being designed in sworn testimony in the Texas State Senate. You can go find it, you can look it up, it's there. And I said, these are designed, to my eye, as the optimal way to further enhance this immune imprinting problem. And it will cause people to be more susceptible to infection and disease because of this problem that has long plagued influenza vaccine development. I mean, this is not new stuff. This has been around for decades. Okay, this is not some great mental leap that I or others made. It was backed by solid data from some of the top laboratories in the world.
Can you just explain what you mean by that? So you mean with influenza, because isn't it the case that there is always mutations and...
If you repeatedly vaccinate, particularly to a limited set of antigens, you will cause your immune system to be trained on those antigens to such an extent that it will default to responding to the old antigens when it's presented with something that's similar but different.
Yeah.
It's like putting blinders on a horse. Now your body, your horse can only see that road, but it can't see these other potentially new proteins.
And so it will mount an immune response as if it's seeing the old pathogen.
Yes.
Okay? And this has been a chronic problem. This, if you notice, influenza vaccine efficacy, this is heresy, okay? They may cut this or you'll be deplatformed from YouTube. The influenza vaccine effectiveness in the field has dropped from about 50 to about 20% now.
And this last year it was 16%.
Okay? And that we have known for a long time that immune imprinting or original antigenic sin is a major driver of this. And now what's happened, because we now have this massive trove of data with this outbreak, and there's been a bit of an advance in the understanding of immune imprinting, because now we know it's not just this general phenomena that we believed we understood, but now we have data showing there's different classes of antibodies. And with
I was
this,
hoping he would bring
with
this
this
up. This is very
vaccinate, we're actually driving people from the categories of antibodies that are known to protect against infectious disease and viruses towards a different category of antibody, Ig4, that is more associated with allergic responses and less effective at fighting off infectious disease. And this gets to, I spoke about this early on in talking to parents. Anybody, if you have a child and your child develops an allergy against pollen,
Peanuts, for example, or
peanuts or grass pollen or whatever. Okay, you go to an allergist or a rheumatologist and you say, Doctor, my son has a peanut allergy. What am I going to do about it? I don't want him to die. And he says, well, here's an EpiPen. I'll take $200. And he says, I'm going to give him a bunch of shots. Okay, he's going to hypervaccinate him.
A little at a time.
Yeah.
A little at a time.
And what that does is it drives tolerance to that peanut. You know this. You've experienced it. The parents that are watching this know this, okay? And by this practice of vax, you're creating that same kind of process immunologically. And why are they doing it? That's the next question.
Can you just clarify though, but with the peanut analogy, you give them a little bit of that, so they build up their tolerance to having a reaction.
Yeah, so very simply, a little protein, a little at a time for the allergy shot. So you calm the immune system down to where it's just eventually not going to react to peanuts. Now for an allergen, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
But to a pathogen, that's a horrible idea.
Right.
Because you don't want to be completely tolerant to where your immune system doesn't recognize an
So the
infectious
key,
agent.
But I think
the
the
key
public
thing
know
here
this
is
as well
there's
with
all
the
these variables.
discussion about antibiotics as well, right? The public knows this in this discussion.
It is actually, that is a good metaphor, the overuse of antibiotics in a big picture sense, 40,000 foot looking down. The overuse of antibiotics that drives the development of antibiotic resistant bugs in livestock and other sources is a reasonable metaphor, sort of. It's a little sketchy at the edges, but it's a good way to kind of think about it. I early on, I used to always say, if you give a 3-year-old a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And that's kind of the way it is with
Am I
some
the
people.
3-year-old in this?
No, I would
it's
I would
kids.
argue that Deborah Birx was the 3-year-old.
Yes. We lost common sense and common science.
Right.
Both. That was the problem.
So what would you say now, moving forward, in terms of, we had a pandemic preparedness strategy internationally. I know there's a discussion with some international organizations trying to change all those around, but what would you say in terms of where we are now and moving forwards, lessons learned? I know one of the big concerns is children. I mean, I notice when I'm in the States that in some letterboxes you're getting flyers to say 6-month-olds should be getting shots.
There's financial incentives and regulatory incentives and liability incentives that drive a lot of that. But your bigger question is pandemic policy, and that's a huge one. Yeah. Okay, and I'd like to start by, again, let's dissect a little bit, go back in time, fall of 2019, Event 201, which I mentioned. Okay, in their war game planning, with all of its biases, they had some starting assumptions. You always do when you do war game planning. You say, okay, these are our starting assumptions. Now we're going to play the game. Those starting assumptions included a highly pathogenic virus. We now know that was false. It included the assumption that there were no repurposed drugs available that would be effective in treatment. We know that was a false hypothesis, a false assumption. And that there would be a vaccine produced rapidly that would be safe and effective. And we now know that's a false hypothesis. That whole war game was built and then implemented based on a set of core assumptions, each of which were never challenged, never modified. I mean, that's when you deal with folks in defense, one of the things that they know, they'll teach you right off the bat, is your battle plans are only as good as until the first time you encounter the enemy. And then you have to modify them. They never modified them. They never revisited those assumptions. They just kept hammering them down. Okay? And I think that one of the core things going forward that we can derive from this is centralized planning with a small insular in-group that suffers from this kind of hubris where they believe that they know. In infectious disease outbreaks, nothing is knowable. Everything is new. It's constantly shifting. It's like you're standing on an iceberg that's melting in a frozen sea. Everything is changing all the time. You have to be really adaptive, and hubris is the enemy. And what we have seen again and again and again is this belief in scientism, in the holy of the revealed word coming from, where's it coming from? Think tanks sponsored by a monopolist multi-billionaire who has no background in training in medicine? Somehow, this is not the way it used to be. This is not the WHO when I was young. This is not the system that used to exist.
I would like to kind of piggyback onto that because you brought it up earlier. What we've also lost is public health. Public health is shattered, broken, and bruised. Did you hear early on, go outside, increase your vitamin D levels, get off your couch and lose some weight, get out in nature, improve the function of your immune system? Shinrin Yoku is Japanese forest bathing, increases your natural killer cell activity. Do some meditation or prayer practice, be in community, cut out the sugars, cut out the unhealthy processed foods. that would have been a public health message saying,
And it would have been a lot more effective than the vaccines.
and there was a great study out of the UK here showing that those who exercised and moved their bodies, and it was a several 100,000 patient retrospective look, decreased their severity and hospitalization risk by about 291%. And then all of us that were criticized for saying vitamin D is helpful. Well, the study finally came out and said, yes, it decreased hospitalization and death by over 30%. It's not, like he says, it's not one part of it. It's multifactorial, absolutely. But where is public health? Public health is captured and compromised.
It is
It
a
should be
servant.
said in Britain,
It's a servant of pharma.
we did have vitamin D, but your points about the multifactorial elements of all of this and considering it with evidence-based approach is really important. Well, we're drawing to the end here, but I think, I could go on for hours with you guys because this is so insightful. And but I think the thing that many people, because I'm a complete layman, and it's very difficult for anyone who's not trained like you guys to make any sense of any of it. But what has really concerned many of us is the suffocation of free speech, the discourse, the ability to have it out, thrash it out, and to work things out. And there's a sense in which, that's been really put off the agenda, but it's become much clearer now. So we really hope it together that we're going to see much more of you guys, and also that we can get some of our the leading advocates of some of the policies that have happened to debate people like yourselves.
Yeah, for some reason that's never happening. I don't understand it. I'm so confused.
Yeah. Well, we've asked them. We've invited people for a national debate on television and everything, but we're going to keep insisting on free speech. I think that many of us that together would like to say very big thank you for being prepared to put your heads above the ground and the pulpit and in difficult circumstances. Where are you off to next? What's your next steps? Just
after we leave London,
Yes.
we travel to Stockholm for a Northern European International Conference that I believe is more focused on trying to assess where we are and trying to start to think through where we're going and what we can do. I think the big challenge we all face right now, we're so caught up in tribalism, certainly in the States. I can't speak for the UK, but I see a little bit of that here from time to time.
Yeah,
absolutely. How do we come together and heal? How without saying that we should forgive and forget those that have led the dysfunctional practices that have caused so much death and destruction. But on a local level, how can we live with each other and try to reform community? And I think that what I've been trying so hard to push out into common awareness is the awareness, the realization that we have all been subjected to a massive propaganda campaign, the likes of which the Western world has never seen before. Yeah. Highly organized, using new technologies that were developed for offshore combat in this PSYOP space that have been deployed against the citizenry. And what I counsel is that we've all been subjected to this massive barrage for 3 years now. Some of us, for whatever reason, have been more resistant to it. Or we've had a series of events that have woken us up, or whatever it is, and now we're aware of what's happened. And the layers keep peeling off. I mean, each of us has what we think is the current awareness, but there's often so much more. And then there's those who have not been able to resist this incredibly well-coordinated propaganda technology that's been deployed. And they're still walking around kind of hypnotized, believing everything they've been told. No surprise. This is highly developed technology that has been deployed against them. And if you take that point of view, then you don't have to hate those people. You don't have to say, look what they've done to me. They forced me to take masks. They forced me into all these policies. They accused me of being the one spreading the virus when in fact they were, if anybody was. All that anger, you can let loose of it a little bit if you say to yourself, hey, good on me. I was able to wake up. Now my job is to help them wake up, not to hate them.
On that note, I just want to say thank you to you both for coming and speaking to us. It's really been wonderful to do this. Obviously, at Together, we think very much that we want to win over as many people in the public, and we do that by having open discussion civilly and not insulting people, but actually listening and trying to win hearts and minds. With that effect as well, we'd very much like you to become a member if you're not, because that's the way we can keep going out to the public and keep campaigning for free speech, for the reinstatement of the care workers, against kids' jabs, and also around some of the technocratic impositions that are happening up and down the country, whether that's LTNs and 15-minute cities or suffocating of productivity. So thanks for joining Together Talks. Thank you very much to Robert and Ryan, and we'll see you very soon.